Hello, this is Dave Hurwitz, Executive Editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to talk about the best recordings of Mahler's Das Klagende Lied. Now, that sort of translates as the Song of Lament, and it was Mahler's self-proclaimed Opus One, the first piece in which he really identified his own style. He was only about 20 when he wrote it, or in his teens when he started. He submitted it for a contest. It lost. I mean, it's the usual story. We don't need to go into those details. But it's an amazing work. It really is, in a lot of ways. There are motives in it that recur later, which I'll talk about in a moment. But the orchestration is already astonishingly bold and inventive, and it has this, in terms of its musical atmosphere, it's of the same world of his songs from Des Knaben Wunderhorn, this sort of German folk style on steroids. It distills everything you want to get from like Wagner and Weber and that whole era, and that way of writing, and packs it into a fairly compact little space. I mean, it's not all that long, depending on which version you do. And we have to talk about those too. But it really is an amazing piece. And unbelievably, it hasn't been recorded all that often, at least as compared to the Mahler symphonies and other works. And it's not really inferior to them. It really isn't, especially in its revised version. It's vintage Mahler. But like every great composer, even composers who write relatively little music, as Mahler did, there are some pieces that are sort of shuffled to the side. They exist on the fringes, and Das Klagende Lied is one of them. The other one, the big one, is his opera, Die Drei Pintos, which is, of course, a pastiche. It's written in the style of Weber, and so nobody gives it any play. And what's more, it's a comic opera, which means no one's really going to give it any play, but it's also quite extraordinarily well done, and a score that's full of marvelous craftsmanship and style, and it really ought to be performed professionally and well, so we get a sense of it. Happily, Das Klagende Lied has been performed professionally and well, and has been recorded enough times that we get a sense of it. But first, we have to talk about the textural issues, of which there are quite a few. Now, originally, Das Klagende Lied was written in 3 parts. They were Waldmarken, which is wood fairy tale in the woods, that sort of thing. Then Der Spielmann, the minstrel, and finally Hochzeitstück, the wedding piece. Those were the 3 parts. In his later life, in revising everything, as Mahler constantly did, he discarded part 1, which is the longest. It plays for about half an hour, and just left parts 2 and 3, and then revised the orchestration of parts 2 and 3 considerably, and created a very compact 40-minute work, which really is an excellent, like second half or even first half piece for a choral concert. It really should be played more often. The only problem is that it's a little bit expensive, because typically with Mahler, it has a large orchestra and an offstage band, which has to be very, very well coordinated in Hochzeitstück. But it's a great work. I mean, it's absolutely a great work. The original version of Waldmarken, it was never revised. And so the way that the piece is usually performed now is to take the original first part and attach it to the revised parts 2 and 3. Now, from a critical edition point of view, this is horrifyingly evil because it mixes sources. But from a musical point of view, it makes no difference whatsoever, because the piece is all vintage Mahler, and it's so completely consistent in terms of his personality and his ethos and stylistic idiom that it makes no difference. The problem with Waldmarken is that it's the weakest of the 3 movements. It really is. Partly because of its length, partly because, for a very simple and sort of boring reason, which is that it has a recurring motive, which the whole piece has. It's simply a descending minor scale. It just goes da 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 da. That's it. And in the more lively version, it becomes bum ba ba da 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 dum bum 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 like that. It's as simple as can be, but you hear it about 30 trillion times. And in particular, in Waldmarken, you hear it at the end of each choral stanza, whether it needs to be there or not, which can sound, it's clumsy. I mean, let's just face it. It was a clumsy thing to do. And so for that reason, I think, partly at least for that reason, the first part sounds a little less convincing than the other two, although it's full of very, very beautiful music. I also think that the epilogue to the first part sort of takes something away from the epilogue to the third part because they're kind of similar. But, who cares? It's juicy, nice Mahler, and it's worth hearing. So that's the way it's often done. There is only one recording of the original unrevised score, which, of course, has been published. Wait a minute. Here in this nice fat blue critical edition, and it's marvelous the way Mahler actually wrote it. To be honest with you, it doesn't really need to be played in the revised version. You can do the original, and it's very convincing. It has some very weird, different things in it. Some things that obviously Mahler was anxious to clean up later on. But for all of its occasional raggedness and immaturity, it's a bold and wild piece, and certainly worth hearing in the original version. But there's only one recording, so we'll get it out of the way right away, that's worth hearing. And that was Kent Nagano's on Erato, it was with the Halle Orchestra. It's out of print. I mean, God knows if you'll find it. I mean, maybe it's available somewhere. It's definitely worth hearing because it's an excellent, excellent performance of the original version. And for some reason, people aren't doing the original version, and they should. We should hear it more frequently. It certainly could use a couple more recordings, maybe not a couple of dozen, but a couple more really solid professional recordings. But for the moment, if you can stumble across Nagano, you've got a great recording of the original version of Das Klagende Lied. The others are all either the hybrid Waldmarken and revised parts 2 and 3, or just parts 2 and 3. And so those are the recordings we're going to talk about. Now, the revised parts 2 and 3 have also been stuck into a critical edition right there, which is the same as what you're going to find if you get the Philharmonia pocket score. For those of you who don't want to spend a fortune for these things, this is the revised parts 2 and 3. Now, there is even an issue with the revised parts 2 and 3. It occurs in the third part or second part of the revised version when the big climax happens where the brass and percussion have been adjusted. And because the critical editions were being written and revised and diddled by the Mahler people at the time that some of these recordings were made, you will hear slightly different things at that moment. And I'll talk about them, with respect to these versions. There are like 3 different ways you can do it. They're tiny differences. They don't make any difference. They're not important, really. But you may notice, because I know how carefully you listen to these things, and you may pick up on it. And it's not a mistake. It's just the way it is. So let's tell the story. Oh, the story. The story is typically stupid, but it doesn't make any difference. It's German romantic stupid. That is, you have a vain queen who says she's going to marry the guy who finds the rare, absolutely impossible to find flower growing in the middle of the forest. And why she does this, heaven only knows. She sends them out on a quest. And on the quest go 2 brothers. The brothers are typically proto-fascist. One is a blonde-haired, blue-eyed hunk. The other is dark and swarthy and dark and swarthy and dark, and that's all you need to know. The blonde guy is the good guy, the brunette is evil, right? Because it's German romantic gobbledygook. So they go, whipping around the forest, and of course the young hunk with the blonde hair, the Hitler Youth guy, he finds the flower. And the older brother, the dark, swarthy older brother, kills him to take the flower and give it to the queen and marry her. That's part one. That's the only thing that happens in part one. And so for it to take half an hour, that's pushing it. But that's part one. In part two, a minstrel, Spielmann, a minstrel is trotting around Spielmanning, and he's walking through the forest, and he finds a pile of human bones. And he picks out the nicest one and says, "Oh, this human bone would make an absolutely terrific flute." Yeah, okay. So he makes a flute out of the bone, and he plays it. And Mahler quotes the opening of Götterdämmerung whenever he plays the flute. And this unearthly voice, usually soprano. Mahler wanted a boy soprano. It's a whole soprano thing. It's actually very interesting because, the idea of using a soprano versus a boy soprano and all that whole business recurs in connection with the finale of the Fourth Symphony. So it tells us we're kind of dealing with the same world, right? Anyway, the voice tells the story of this murder. And the minstrel thinks to himself, "Gee, this is entertaining. I think I'm going to go and play my flute at the wedding of the queen, because the wedding guests, who will be celebrating and getting drunk and having a blast of a time, want nothing more than to hear this fabulous story of this awful murder." And off he goes. Now, part three is the most fun, of course, because first of all, the wedding celebrations are going full tilt, and there's this festive party music described by the chorus. And then there's this offstage dance band, which is entertaining the guests at the wedding. And the music there is amazing. It is the first example we have of that cheap, sleazy, vernacular that Mahler uses often in his music. And it's marvelous. It is such trash, and deliberate trash. I'm sure that the people who are judging this piece at the competition took one look at that and said, "Holy crap, what is this?" It's marvelous. And the big problem in performance of Hochzeitstück is that in so many performances, the offstage band is way too far away. The whole point is just to know that it's in a different space. It doesn't have to be like it's in a different galaxy. You want to hear what Mahler wrote, because the orchestration and the tunes and all that, it's just wonderful the way it's written. And most performances, I think, get it wrong. I think it's just ridiculous to do that. Not only that, but there has to be really, and Mahler even writes a footnote about it in the score, really careful coordination between the offstage band and the onstage orchestra. I mean, hair trigger, hair split stuff, which they can always get right in recordings, but that doesn't mean it sounds right sonically. You want to be able to hear the exchanges as the offstage band gives over to the onstage instruments and whatnot. And in some performances, it's very unconvincingly done. So you should just keep that in mind. But anyway, they're playing, and everyone's having a good time, and the offstage band is going, and the minstrel shows up, and of course, as soon as he shows up, the hall becomes dark, and everyone goes, "What's this?" And oh my God, and they don't know why, and they don't know what's going on, and he plays the flute, and the flute tells the story, and everyone goes, "Oh, whoa!" There's a refrain in this piece, "Oh, Leide, weh," as in oy vey, "Oh, sorrow, woe, woe," lots of woe. And the woe motive in this piece is going to return in the finale of the Fourth Symphony. The woe motive, which is sung in this piece to woe, is this. Now, you know that from the First Symphony. So be prepared. You'll get to hear it again. Anyway, so they all sing about woe and misery, and they sing, the flute thing sings the song, and then the king, who is the evil brother, the murderer, jumps up and snatches the flute, and under an irresistible demonic compulsion, puts it to his lips. Remember, this is his brother's, tibia that he's playing here, right? And the flute sings the song of the murder, and the castle collapses and everybody dies. And that's the end. It's wonderful, isn't it? But there is an absolutely beautiful, beautiful epilogue after the castle collapses and everybody dies. And the last words go to the soprano. Ach, leider, oh, sorrow. It's so romantic, right? And the whole thing ends with a big bang, just a crash, and it's over. And it's just wonderful. So that's basically how it works. And those are the various textural issues and differences with versions and all that folderol. So now we get to talk about recordings. There are two you definitely do not want. I'm only dealing with like major ones. There have been some minor recordings by people we don't need to care about, and I'm not even going to talk about them. I'm only discussing what I think are the ones that really matter. I mean, there was like an old Win Morris version, forget it. Yeah, there was an old one on Hungariton, which wasn't bad actually, but you'll never find it. You know, we don't have to make ourselves crazy. There was one on MD&G with the Beethoven Orchestra of Bonn, which is just, oh God, it's boring. So, but of the major ones you're likely to run into, you will find Simon Rattles. I have in this big Mahler box. It's not well recorded. Primarily, the playing is indifferent. The choral singing is so-so. It doesn't really matter. By the way, there are a bunch of soloists in this. Usually, a soprano, an alto, and a tenor, and the usual soloists. But depending which version they're in, they kind of come and go. One of the criticisms about Das Klagende Lied is that there isn't any reason why anybody sings what they do, which is true because there are no real parts assigned to it. Mahler just mixes them up to try and keep things interesting, which I would rather hear. I think that's fine. I don't think we need reasons why certain singers sing certain things as long as there's enough variety and color in the music, and there is, so that's okay. All right? So Simon Rattle, forget about. Pierre Boulez, he did it twice, and we're going to get to his first version in a moment. His second version is of the revised two-part version, and like so much late Boulez, it's a boring non-happening. It's not worth thinking about twice either. It's just blah, forget it. Now, let's talk about the 5 versions I have here that are worth considering. The first is Pierre Boulez's first recording with the London Symphony for Sony. Now, this one was the first recording of the Waldmarken, the original Part 1, grafted onto the revised Parts 2 and 3. It's kind of a rough and ready performance of the whole work. It really is. It's a little slow. It's a little sloppy, but it's exciting. I mean, it has the right color and the right atmosphere, and a really good recording of the offstage band in Part 3. It's the closest of all of them. You can hear what they're playing, which I think is actually quite important. It ain't my favorite version, but I have a sort of nostalgic fondness for it. So, you could do worse. Next, a surprisingly good one, Giuseppe Synopoly. This is with the Philharmonia. Synopoly's Mahler was weird. It was just weird. I mean, it was somewhat indifferently played and often very self-indulgent in terms of its, luxuriating in Mahlerian decadence, which is fun to hear once, but not twice. But the Das Klagende Lied here was very, very well done. It's well recorded. It's well played. It's a good performance. It really is. You have to crank up the volume a bit, but you'll get an exciting, sensible 3-part Das Klagende Lied. Also first-rate, Schaies. This was from the same period where he did that terrific Gurlieder. Remember that? With the Deutsche Symphony Orchestra Berlin. And it really is first class. That weird moment, in the third part where I talk about where the percussion things are done, he uses a version that nobody does. I don't think there's something happens with the brass parts. Synopoly does it in accordance with the latest critical edition. Boulez has the older version where you hear the extra sort of bass drum and cymbals going boom, but a chunk, a boom, but a chunk, which is kind of fun. They're different in that one little passage in 3 different ways. I have no idea why, and I'm not worrying about it. It doesn't matter. But the Schaies is worth considering. But there are 2 versions that we need to recommend. The final recommendations for the 2-part version, it's a no-brainer. It's Haitink in the Concertgebouw. This is coupled with the 3rd Symphony. It was one of the DG originals. It's a great 3rd Symphony, too. It really is his first one. Absolutely first rate, and it's the only 2-part Das Klagende Lied worth having. Really is the only one. It's head and shoulders above the rest. It's the Concertgebouw. It is the echt Mahler style. It's beautifully recorded. It comes from the period when Philips had finally figured out how to put bass into their Concertgebouw recordings, which is really a nice thing to have in this piece. It's beautifully sung, first class in every way. However, if you're going to get one, and only one Das Klagende Lied, the one to get, and thank God it's still available, maybe a little pricey, but it's the way it goes. If you're not willing to spend $20 for Das Klagende Lied, then you're not a serious Mahler person anyway, are you? Michael Tilson Thomas with the San Francisco Symphony. It's now, as this was originally recorded for RCA, but the San Francisco Symphony label took it over, which was one of the smartest things they ever did. Tilson Thomas also has a very variable Mahler cycle, often very good, but somewhat mannered and affected in places, and the sonics are hit and miss. But this was terrific. It is terrific. It has a first-class roster of soloists. I'll tell you who they are just for the fun of it. Let's see. Marina something or other. Yeah. Michel de Jong, Thomas Moser, Serge Lieferkus, Maria Shagic. Never mind. I shouldn't have even tried. This is what I get for trying to be informative. Michael Tilson Thomas, San Francisco Symphony Orchestra and Chorus. This is the Mahler Das Klagende Lied to get. The others are good. If you have them, you won't. It's not a tragedy. You'll certainly get a sense of the piece. But for the best, that's the one to have. And it's pretty clear. Its superiority is really, really pretty clear. I mean, the orchestra plays wonderfully. The San Francisco Symphony Chorus is one of the best symphony choruses out there. And Tilson Thomas gets into the youthful energy of the piece very, very nicely without futzing around with it overtly. And that's where you go. So that's the story of Das Klagende Lied. We all need to keep on listening and stop klagending. we used to call it Das Kvetch. It was just complaining. But it's lament. It's sorrow, right? But it's one of those lovely, gory, grim fairy tale stories, and the music it's so right for what Mahler wants to do. I mean, he knew himself, even at that early age, and he turned out this youthful masterpiece, and it really is in its way for its originality and its color and its melodic content. It's just beautiful, and if you don't know it, you really should. It's kind of like the Kullervo of the Mahler world, if you're a Sibelius fan. These big early choral stuff where the composer comes into his own, and nobody seemed to care. We care. You care. I care. Thank you. Enjoy.